What if a child's silent tears held a secret that could change everything? A seasoned school bus driver began noticing a young black girl quietly crying every afternoon during his route through Decatur, Georgia. Day by day, her silent sorrow grew harder to ignore, stirring a deep concern in his heart. One afternoon, after dropping off the last of the students, he made a decision he couldn't put off any longer. He walked back to her seat and looked beneath it, and what he found made his breath catch in his chest. Charles Baker adjusted his rearview mirror as the yellow school bus rumbled through the suburban streets of Decatur, Georgia. At 61, the retired Vietnam veteran had spent the last 6 years driving the Route 7 bus for Eastwood Middle School. The job gave him a sense of purpose, a reason to get up every morning. The late afternoon sun painted long shadows across the cracked sidewalks, and Charles tapped the steering wheel lightly, humming an old Sam Cooke tune under his breath. It was a typical Wednesday. The bus buzzed with chatter and laughter, sneakers squeaking on the rubber floor, backpacks thumping into seats. Kids shouted about the Braves game, about homework, about who said what on TikTok. Charles smiled faintly. Some things never changed. Yet, as he glanced into the mirror again, his smile faded. Could this be the moment that uncovers a hidden tragedy? There in the third row was the little girl he'd been worried about all week. Her name was Aaliyah Simmons, a quiet 6th grader who had only started riding his bus 2 weeks ago. She sat alone, small hands clenched in her lap, her head bent low. Through the gap in the seats, Charles could see the faint shimmer of tears on her cheeks. Every day it was the same as silent, hidden tears after the first few stops when the bus began to empty out. Today, though, something different caught his attention. As he made a sharp right onto Elmhurst Avenue, Charles caught a glimpse of Aaliyah bending over sharply, reaching down toward the floor under her seat. She stayed hunched over for a few seconds longer than seemed natural, her shoulders trembling. Then she sat up again quickly, swiping at her face with the sleeve of her denim jacket. Charles's gut tightened. He'd seen plenty of kids over the years who had rough patches, divorces, money problems, bullying. But something about Aaliyah's sorrow seemed heavier, deeper. He made a mental note to talk to her when he could do so gently without scaring her. Stop after stop, the bus grew quieter. By the time Charles turned onto Magnolia Lane, only 3 kids remained. Aaliyah's stop was the last one near an aging set of apartment buildings with paint peeling off the rails. As they neared her drop-off, Charles pressed the brake pedal slowly, pulling up beside Building 14. "Here you go, sweetheart," he said softly. Aaliyah grabbed her battered purple backpack and shuffled toward the door without looking up. Charles noticed the way she hugged the bag tightly against her chest as if it were a shield. Her sneakers scuffed the steps as she descended. She gave a brief wave without turning around and walked toward the cracked sidewalk leading to her apartment. Charles hesitated. Something nodded at him. As he waited for her to disappear inside, he found his eyes drawn back to the seat where she had been. He thought again about the strange way she had leaned down earlier. His curiosity, or maybe it was something deeper, that old soldier's instinct, got the better of him. Climbing slowly out of his seat, he moved down the aisle, his boots heavy against the metal floor. When he reached the third row, he knelt, his knees protesting the movement with a sharp ache. Peering under the seat, he expected to find maybe a lost pencil, a crumpled tissue. Instead, he found something that made his breath hitch sharply in his throat. There, wedged between the seat frame and the ventilation grate, was a small, worn plastic lunchbox. It was cracked at the corners and covered in faded Disney princess stickers. Charles reached out carefully, tugging it free. It felt strangely heavy for its size. He popped the lid open and gasped. Inside were items that should never have been hidden in a lunchbox: a half-empty bottle of ibuprofen, a bruised and battered flip phone with a shattered screen, a wrinkled note scrawled in messy handwriting. "If you tell anybody, they'll take you away from your mama forever." Charles's hand trembled slightly as he put the lid back on. His heart pounded painfully against his ribs. Every instinct screamed that something was terribly wrong. He sat there for a long moment, the rumble of the idling bus engine the only sound. Outside, Aaliyah's apartment door had closed, but a dim light flickered behind the threadbare curtains. Charles knew he couldn't just drive away and pretend he hadn't seen it. He returned to the driver's seat and pulled his phone from the glove compartment. For a few seconds, he just stared at it, debating. He didn't want to make assumptions. Maybe it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe the poor girl was just being bullied at school and scared of teachers or classmates. But deep down, he knew better. Instead of calling the principal, who Charles suspected would file a report and leave it at that, he made a different choice. He called his neighbor and close friend, Officer Raymond Davis of the Decatur Police Department. Raymond picked up on the second ring. "Charlie, what's up?" Charles spoke quietly, laying out what he had found, describing Aaliyah's daily tears, the lunchbox under the seat, the threatening note. There was a pause on the line. Then Raymond's voice dropped into a serious register. "Stay put," Raymond said. "I'm 5 minutes away." True to his word, a patrol car pulled up next to the bus within minutes, lights off, moving quietly. Raymond climbed out, his uniform crisp, his dark eyes scanning the apartment complex with trained precision. Charles handed over the lunchbox without a word. Raymond's jaw tightened as he read the note. "I'll need to do a welfare check," Raymond said grimly. "You sure you saw her go into that apartment?" Charles nodded. "Unit 14C. Raymond nodded back and headed up the sidewalk, radioing for backup. Charles sat back, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. His mind raced with questions. What if he had missed the signs? How many days had Aaliyah suffered in silence before someone noticed? His throat burned with guilt and helplessness. Within minutes, 2 more patrol cars arrived. Officers moved quickly but carefully, knocking first, then announcing themselves. When there was no answer, they gained entry with a master key from the complex manager, who had shown up looking nervous and confused. Charles watched from the bus as the front door swung open. What happened next made his heart clench painfully. Aaliyah emerged, clutching a tattered teddy bear to her chest. Her face was pale, streaked with tears. Her thin shoulders hunched as if trying to make herself invisible. Behind her, a woman stumbled into view, clearly intoxicated, hair matted, yelling incoherently. Charles felt a wave of sickness as he realized the woman barely noticed Aaliyah, focused instead on screaming at the officers about minding their damn business. One of the officers gently knelt beside Aaliyah, speaking softly, while another escorted the woman, presumably her mother, out of the apartment in handcuffs. Raymond came back to the bus, his face grim. "Neglect charges," he said quietly. "Looks like more than that, too. We'll have CPS here in a minute." Charles nodded mutely. He felt old, suddenly bone-deep, tired, but he also felt something else burning under his ribs, a fierce protectiveness he hadn't felt since the days he wore a uniform himself. He wouldn't let this child fall through the cracks. Not on his watch. Charles remained seated behind the wheel, watching as Aaliyah was gently led toward a patrol car. She clutched her teddy bear like a life raft. Her dark eyes were wide and uncertain. Officer Raymond Davis knelt beside her, speaking in low tones meant to soothe, but the girl flinched at every sudden movement around her. Charles's chest tightened. He had seen soldiers look like that, raw, stripped of safety, eyes too old for their faces. Aaliyah was placed carefully in the back of a police cruiser, separate from the car where her mother, still cursing and thrashing, had been secured. Charles knew this wasn't the end of her pain, only the beginning of a long, painful process. As the Child Protective Services worker, a woman named Miss Darlene Monroe, arrived and began gathering information, Charles decided he couldn't just drive away and let someone else finish the story. After checking in quickly with the CPS agent, he asked if he could accompany them to the station, at least to offer some support to the little girl who had already come to trust his quiet presence. Ms. Monroe hesitated but eventually agreed. And so Charles followed the caravan of flashing lights through the dusky streets of Decatur. The bus rattled behind like a lumbering yellow dinosaur. At the Eastwood police station, Aaliyah sat in a worn chair outside the family services room, swinging her feet slowly. Her small body was wrapped in a county-issued blanket, and she looked smaller than ever under the harsh fluorescent lights. Charles sat down across from her, removing his ball cap respectfully and resting it in his lap. "You doing okay, sweetheart?" he asked gently. She nodded, but said nothing. After a moment, she fished something from her jacket pocket, a small plastic charm bracelet missing half its beads, and began twisting it nervously between her fingers. Charles watched her, feeling a hollow ache settle in his chest. How long had she been trying to hold herself together with nothing but tiny scraps of comfort like that broken bracelet? A social worker finally called them into a small interview room. The walls were painted a sickly shade of green, meant to be soothing, but succeeding only in looking tired. Charles stayed back against the wall while Ms. Monroe knelt in front of Aaliyah. "Sweetheart, can you tell me about the note we found? Who gave it to you?" Aaliyah shrank back in her chair, and Charles saw her hands clench into tiny fists. After a long pause, she whispered, "It was Mr. Reggie, Mama's boyfriend. He said, if I told, I'd be taken away and Mama would go to jail." Ms. Monroe kept her voice steady. "And the pills in your lunchbox?" Aaliyah hesitated. "Sometimes he made me take medicine. Said it would make me grow up faster. I didn't like it. Made my stomach hurt." Charles's fists clenched involuntarily. Rage simmered low and dangerous in his gut, but he forced himself to stay silent. Aaliyah needed calm, not more shouting. Over the next hour, a clearer and darker picture emerged. Reggie Simmons, the mother's boyfriend, had been using threats and emotional abuse to control Aaliyah, while her mother, addicted and indifferent, looked the other way. The pills were a mixture, some ibuprofen, some leftover prescription medications, even a few expired antibiotics. It was sheer luck Aaliyah hadn't gotten seriously ill yet. When asked why she hid the lunchbox under the bus seat, Aaliyah's answer was simple and heartbreaking. "I didn't want Mama to find it and get mad." By the time they finished, the clock on the wall read nearly 8:30 p.m. Ms. Monroe explained that Aaliyah would be placed in emergency foster care for the night until a longer-term arrangement could be made. Aaliyah stared at the floor, shoulders slumped. Charles cleared his throat. "If it's allowed," he said, surprising even himself, "I'd be willing to stay with her tonight, at least until y'all figure out where she should go." Ms. Monroe looked skeptical. "Mr. Baker, while I appreciate your kindness, the system has protocols. Foster placement needs background checks, home inspections." Charles nodded. "I get it, but maybe I could just stay at the station here, sit with her, keep her company so she's not alone, just until a foster parent arrives." Ms. Monroe conferred briefly with a superior, and then, after some paperwork and a lot of stern warnings about boundaries, agreed. Charles felt a rush of fierce gratitude. He wasn't sure why he cared so much. Maybe it was because he'd seen too many kids slip through cracks no one noticed until it was too late. They moved Aaliyah to a quieter break room away from the noisy dispatch area. Charles sat down heavily in a battered recliner while Aaliyah curled up in a corner of the couch, the blanket still wrapped around her. She drifted in and out of restless sleep. Charles watched over her like a sentry, his own eyes gritty with fatigue, but unwilling to leave her unguarded. Around midnight, a foster care representative arrived, a woman named Mrs. Gloria King with kind eyes and a tired smile. She knelt in front of Aaliyah and introduced herself softly. "Hi, honey. My name's Gloria. I'm going to take you somewhere safe, okay? You'll have your own room, your own bed, and nobody's going to make you cry anymore." Aaliyah blinked sleepily at her, then looked over at Charles. For a terrifying moment, he thought she might cry, but instead, she gave him a tiny, shy smile. Charles rose stiffly and knelt beside her. "You're going to be just fine, sweetheart," he said. "And if you ever need me, I'm not going anywhere." Aaliyah reached out her hand, small, trembling, trusting, and Charles squeezed it gently. He watched as Gloria led her down the hallway, her small figure silhouetted against the sterile hospital lights. When they disappeared around the corner, Charles slumped into a chair, utterly drained. He rubbed a hand over his face and whispered a quiet prayer for Aaliyah's healing, for strength, for a world where no little girl ever had to hide her pain under a bus seat. Outside, the night was cool and still. Charles shuffled toward his old Ford pickup, parked under a flickering street lamp. He climbed in and sat there for a long time, staring at the dashboard without really seeing it. His mind replayed Aaliyah's broken voice, the haunted look in her eyes. He had been a soldier once, trained to fight for the vulnerable, to stand between evil and the innocent. Tonight, in his own quiet way, he had fought again. When he finally started the truck and rumbled down the empty streets toward home, he knew one thing for certain. He was not finished with Aaliyah Simmons's story. Not by a long shot. The next morning, Charles woke before dawn. Sleep had come in restless fragments, haunted by images of Aaliyah sitting alone in that sterile police station break room. As the coffee pot gurgled in his tiny kitchen, Charles sat at the table, staring out the window at the mist rolling over the cracked sidewalks of his Decatur neighborhood. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was supposed to do more. After breakfast, he made a decision. He pulled on his old bomber jacket, the one from his Air Force days, and drove straight to the Eastwood police station. Officer Davis was just coming off night shift and looked surprised to see him. "Morning, Charlie. You holding up?" Charles shrugged barely. "Listen, Ray, you know how to reach that foster lady, Miss Gloria? I was wondering if it's allowed, maybe I could visit Aaliyah sometime. Just check in." Davis studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll make a call." While Charles waited, he paced the worn linoleum floor, the scent of stale coffee and disinfectant filling the air. Finally, Davis waved him over. "Gloria says yes, but supervised visits only, at least for now. Paperwork's got to be done first." Charles filled out the necessary forms with trembling hands. He had never been through anything like this before. It felt intrusive, personal questions about his background, his health, even his financial status. Still, he didn't hesitate. When it came to that little girl, no inconvenience was too big. A few days later, Charles pulled up outside a modest brick house in nearby Clarkston. Gloria King met him at the door, her welcoming smile easing some of his nerves. Inside, the place was cozy but tidy, filled with the smells of cinnamon and laundry soap. Aaliyah was sitting at a small kitchen table coloring when she looked up and saw him. For a moment, she froze. Then, slowly, she smiled. It wasn't a big smile, not the kind that split your face wide open, but it was real. Charles felt something unclench inside his chest. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said, stepping inside carefully, as if afraid to break the moment. Gloria bustled around them, making tea and chatting about nothing important. Charles knelt beside Aaliyah's chair. "How you holding up?" She shrugged, then surprised him by saying, "Better now." He smiled back, blinking against the sudden sting in his eyes. They spent the afternoon together playing simple board games and talking in fits and starts. Aaliyah was cautious, but she opened up more than Charles expected. She told him about her love of drawing, her dream of becoming a veterinarian, how she missed her old school in Savannah, where things had been happier. Charles listened more than he spoke, nodding and encouraging her gently, letting her set the pace. As the sun slanted low through the kitchen windows, Gloria gave him a meaningful look. Visiting hours were ending. Charles rose slowly, patting Aaliyah's hand. "I'll be back, kiddo. You count on that." She nodded solemnly, her small fingers brushing against his like a whispered promise. In the following weeks, Charles became a fixture in Aaliyah's new life. He visited twice a week, sometimes bringing small gifts, a box of crayons, a second-hand library book about animals, a pair of pink sneakers he found on sale. He attended her first therapy session at the community center, sitting quietly in the waiting room while she learned how to name the things that had hurt her. He cheered for her at her first soccer game with the Clarkston Youth League, hollering so loudly when she scored a goal that several parents turned to stare. Aaliyah blossomed slowly, like a cautious flower testing the spring air after a long winter. She laughed more, made friends at her new school, and began sleeping through the night without nightmares. Charles could see the light returning to her eyes day by day. And somehow, without either of them ever saying it aloud, he knew he had become part of her family, the family she had needed all along. One rainy Saturday afternoon, Charles sat in Gloria's living room, helping Aaliyah with a science project. She was building a model of the solar system out of foam balls and coat hangers. As she painstakingly painted tiny Saturn rings, she said without looking up, "Mr. Baker, do you think I could call you Grandpa?" Charles froze, the breath leaving his lungs in a whoosh. He stared at her bent head, at the careful way she dabbed blue paint on Jupiter's swirling storms. He thought about all the years he had spent alone after his wife passed, the empty house filled with echoes, the birthdays and holidays spent quietly because there was no one left to celebrate. Tears blurred his vision as he cleared his throat. "Sweetheart," he said hoarsely, "I'd be honored." From that day on, Aaliyah called him Grandpa Charlie, and the name fit so naturally that even strangers assumed they were blood. Charles attended school events as her guardian, proudly wearing a button that read, "Best Grandpa Ever," that she had made in art class. On Saturdays, they went to the farmer's market where Charles taught her how to pick ripe peaches, and the two of them taste tested every free sample until vendors recognized them by sight. They built a quiet, steady life together, full of small rituals that stitched their broken pieces into something whole. Months later, after countless court dates and hearings, Aaliyah's case finally came to a close. Reggie Simmons was convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to 25 years without parole. Her mother, after completing a court-ordered rehabilitation program, voluntarily relinquished parental rights, acknowledging in a tearful hearing that she was not capable of providing a safe home for her daughter. It was a bitter mercy, but one that allowed Aaliyah to move forward without the shadow of divided loyalties. One bright May morning, standing in a small courtroom with Gloria and Charles by her side, Aaliyah officially became part of Charles Baker's family. The judge, a kindly older woman with silver hair, smiled warmly at them as she finalized the adoption. "Congratulations, Mr. Baker," she said. "You're officially her legal guardian, though from what I can tell, you've been her grandpa in every way that matters for a long time already." Outside the courthouse, Charles lifted Aaliyah into a bear hug, spinning her around as she squealed with laughter. Passers-by smiled at the sight, not knowing the long, painful road that had brought them there. Charles didn't care. He only knew that for the first time in many, many years, he felt young again, more alive than he ever had behind the wheel of a bus or a wrench or anything else. That evening, they celebrated at Miss Shirley's Diner, a neighborhood institution where the servers knew Charles by name and slipped extra biscuits onto his plate. Aaliyah wore a new dress that Gloria had bought her, pink with little yellow daisies, and her hair was braided neatly down her back. As they waited for their food, Charles raised his glass of sweet tea. "To new beginnings," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Aaliyah clinked her lemonade against his glass with a wide grin. "To family," she said simply. Later, as Charles tucked her into bed in her newly painted lavender room at his house, Aaliyah yawned and whispered, "Thanks for finding my lunchbox, Grandpa." Charles kissed her forehead, his voice rough with unshed tears. "Thank you, baby girl, for letting me find you." As he turned off the light and closed the door softly behind him, Charles felt a peace settle over him that he hadn't known in decades. Life hadn't given either of them what they thought they wanted, but somehow, in the unlikeliest of ways, it had given them exactly what they needed: each other. And that, Charles thought as he sat on the porch under the stars, was the greatest victory he could ever have hoped for. If this heartwarming story touched you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more inspiring tales on BUP Stories.